Well, as the Omicron COVID variant spreads around the world, governments are once again tightening travel restrictions. Airlines, hotels and many other businesses will struggle with losing trade during the usually busy Christmas season. Paul Charles is the CEO at the travel PR firm, the PC Agency.
The problem is that the industry is going backwards again, understandably, as governments put in place restrictions that we thought we'd moved on from. So, yes, you're seeing an industry that is very much in limbo at the moment as more countries put in place worsening restrictions as far as the travel and tourism sector is concerned. This is a sector that employs traditionally 1 in 10 people in most economies. And as you can imagine, many tens of thousands of jobs were lost during the first stage of the pandemic. And now as we move towards an epidemic, it looks as though things are getting worse again. So it's not a pretty picture at all for the sector.
You must sympathise with governments. I mean, surely changing travel regulations in response to Omicron, a rampant virus, surely makes sense, doesn't it?
Well, it makes sense to put in place the right restrictions, and those are more individually based measures rather than blanket measures. One of the problems is governments are being ultra cautious because they don't know how Omicron is going to spread yet. They don't know its severity, but they've put in place the most severe of restrictions, blanket measures. And blanket measures don't work. They don't stop, as we've seen in Australia and New Zealand and other countries, infections actually coming in. What they should be doing is putting in place more testing-only based measures rather than quarantine measures, which simply put off people from travelling. And that's the mistake that governments are making. They're resorting to the policies they first put in place early on in the pandemic. But we need to move on and learn to live with COVID now, because there will be future variants, not just this one.
You may have heard us reporting on the UK Finance Minister announcing a $1.3 billion bailout to help the hospitality sector. What support do you want to see, and how would it work?
Well, some of the smaller businesses in the travel and tourism sector actually may be eligible for some of that funding that the Chancellor has announced, depending on how their businesses operate. We're still waiting for the full details. But in essence, the government should be supporting along the lines of the furlough scheme, which they, of course, introduced in the UK and other countries, especially in Europe, earlier on in the pandemic. At the moment, travel and tourism businesses are in limbo because the government is effectively saying to people to be cautious. Well, that's putting off people, but the government is not asking for a full closure or a lockdown, and therefore extra funding is not kicking in. What they need to be doing is choosing not a halfway house, but a position either way. They either say you need to close and people can't travel, or they need to be saying you can travel just with precautions and take it easy. But at the moment, this limbo, this halfway house, means people aren't choosing to book at the moment, and that, of course, means there's no cash coming into businesses. So the government really needs to put in place a furlough scheme if they're serious about restrictions being in place.